Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds to let everybody in who's in the waiting room, and then we'll make a start. Hope everybody's okay on this. What day are we on? Thursday. We're on Thursday. That's good. I know what day it is. Don't always. Right. So I think we might just be about there. Wonderful. I'll make a start because I know it's an hour, people are taking times out of the day, and everyone is massively busy at the moment. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first event of the year from the CIPR Yorkshire and Lincolnshire group. I'm Sarah Hawthorne. I am the chair of the Yorkshire and Lincolnshire group, and I'm delighted to introduce this event on ethics as part of Ethics Month. And I'm sure everyone will be delighted to get their 5 CPD points for this event as well. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of background about the CIPR. If you are not a member, if you are a member, you already know this, but just a quick word on the CIPR. It's one of the largest professional bodies for PR professionals. It has over 10,000 members. It offers training right through to the chartership. It offers awards, conferences. It has its own charity, which is eye provision, and this month is Ethics Month, so it's running a host of events throughout the month for a lot of different groups and centrally, which you can find details of on the CIPR website. So I am delighted today to introduce our great panel. We have Bridget Ahern, who specialises in public services. She's also a committee member of the North West group as well. We have Martin Flegg, who specialises in internal communications, and Paddy Bloor, who specialises in the oil and gas industries. The event is chaired by the fantastic Rebecca Ben, who will be posing questions and talking to the panellists about their own respective and individual challenges around ethical practice based on the industries that they have been working in over the last few years. With that, I am going to one more thing. If you have questions, please submit them in the chat if you can. We have the lovely Rebecca from our CIPR group monitoring the chat, so she will be able to pick up any questions. Again, if you have any issues or sound issues or technical issues, let us know in the chat as well if you can. So with that, I'm going to go on mute and hide my video, and I'm going to hand you over to Rebecca. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes. So we're all here to talk about ethics. It's Ethics Month. So I thought it'd be a nice way to start to just introduce the panel. So just like a quick introduction about kind of what you've done and kind of a bit about your experience. I think, as Sarah said, my name's Rebecca Ben. I've got a lot of experience in working in the public sector. I've been there for far too long. So that's kind of where my expertise come from. And I'll hand over to Bridget. Just a quick intro, please, Bridget.
Hi, Bridget Ahern. I am a serial public sector communicator, having been a journalist before that and then gone through police, fire, local government with a little dabble in nuclear on the way.
and Bridget, thank you. Martin, next.
Hi everyone, I'm Martin Flegg. I'm an independent consultant now. I run my own company called the IC Citizen. I specialise in internal comms, employee engagement and change communication. I also teach internal communications for PR Academy on some of their CIPR accredited internal communication courses.
Brilliant, thank you, Martin. And last but not least, Paddy, please.
Hi, I'm Paddy. I've been doing comms for 20 years after failed careers in investment banking and counterinsurgency. I focus on energy and extractives, primarily strategic comms, looking at geopolitics, capital markets, that sort of stuff. Looking forward to having a chat.
Brilliant. And I think what would be good to kind of kick it off is to ask, you know, why does it matter and why is it so critical for us all to be versed in the ethics of our profession? So yeah, I'm just going to hand that out to the floor. Maybe start alphabetically, however anybody feels. Bridget, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, I think it's a good place to start because I don't think you can want to do communications for the public sector and make a difference to the lives of ordinary people without having quite the compass to guide you to want to do the right thing. So I'm sure it'll come out in some of the examples, but you know, I was taught the kind of journalism which is, if one person tells you it's raining and another person tells you it's not our job to quote both of them. It's our job to stick our heads out the effing window, I think the phrase goes, and decide whether it's raining. And that kind of ethos carries over into public service principles. We've got the Nolan principles to guide us, but it's just doing the right thing for ordinary people to make their lives that little bit better by the work that we do. So all of the codes of conduct, the different societies that we can be part of, just put some structure around this. But there's just that, you know, core within me, which is helping ordinary people.
And Martin?
Yeah, I think in the context of internal communication, I think it's important to be really aware of ethical standards and ethical practice, because in organisations there's this big tension between two big stakeholder groups. So on one hand, you've got leaders and their demands on employees, and on the other side, you've got employees and their needs and requirements. So there's always a tension there between those two groups, and it's important to be able to recognise when those things might be about to boil over, and be able to recognise those early so you can do something about it.
Yeah, definitely. Paddy?
For me, it's about credibility. If your job is external facing, we don't have the luxury of our legal colleagues who are part of a system which sort of underpins 21st century liberal democracy. You can work for a bad guy as a lawyer because you can say that you are part of a system that is part of our democratic right. You can't do that if you're a PR person. And so you have to be trusted. You have to demonstrate that you are committed to doing things in the right way. Even if you are working in a challenging and contentious situation, if your counterparties, if broader society knows that they can trust you as an individual and broader I don't want to get into the profession or industry, but people that look and sound like you, that's important for us all, because we all basically work on trust. And I think that's why ethics is so important, so that we can all be trusted as professionals.
Yeah, definitely. I think when I think about comms and the comms profession, you know, what I think of is that transparency. In a way, it's like being the conscience of a company sometimes, and it kind of reminds me of something that like an old saying that somebody said, ethics is one of those things that you do when nobody's looking. And like thinking about that, I'm really curious to kind of understand where you think you get your ethical standpoint from. So, you know, what drives you to have that ethical standpoint that you do? I'll say again, I'll open it up to anybody actually.
Shall I go first?
Go for it.
I think I get my ethical standpoint or viewpoint from a sort of a position of compromise, I think, and that sounds like a bad thing, but it isn't. And I think what we need to recognise is that ethics is not a black and white thing. It's a very grey kind of continuum where we are trying to find the right way for perhaps different groups of stakeholders. And PR essentially is about management of stakeholders, and all those stakeholders are different viewpoints and different needs. So trying to find the right way and the fair thing for groups of multiple stakeholders is a compromise, and I think we have to recognise that.
That's a really good point. Paddy, I see you nodding your head.
I really like the intellectual construct of compromise. I think it's great. I think it's really smart. I haven't heard it before, and I just, Martin, I think that's brilliant. I'm going to steal that. Cheers. It's boring, but I get sort of my ethical makeup from my parents and my family, and that I'm not that different from the 18-year-old that got kicked out of school and went out to work, and I'm not that different from, and that was the result of the upbringing I had and the family that I had, and we all change, we all mature, we all get different, but actually I do think about, how am I going to explain this to my dad, who had a vaguely parallel career to me, in that my nickname on this is Padsky, because I've spent a lot of time in Moscow and Almaty and places like that, as did he. And so he understands the people I'm working with, and he will look at me and go, "Are you sure, son?" And so I still think of this in my mind, of explaining it to my old man, because he, of all the people that I live with, actually knows who I'm talking about. And so that's part of it. It's family. It's making sure I can look my dad in the eye when we go out for a drink and feel honourable with that.
That's a good point. I sometimes think, what would my grandma think of this? Yeah, she'd be wagging her finger at me like that.
I think the way the sort of phrase I always have in my head around things like that is, can I look myself in the mirror before I go to bed at night, what I've done about the day's work? And to build on some of what both Martin and Paddy have said, that concept of compromise is at the heart of public relations, because public relations isn't media relations, it isn't just internal comms, and we can have all sorts of arguments about what some of the different audiences and channels are that we're here to serve. But if you look at the true definition of public relations, it's absolutely embedded in that idea of compromise. We are here to help different publics relate, and that is a strategic management function. It's about considering, is what that person's saying and that person's saying both fundamentally true? Because I'm dealing with a practical example like this today, and I don't know if Steve from my team has made it onto the webinar, but there are two things that we're dealing with today, and that's somebody's truth and that's somebody's truth. And actually our job is to get them there in the middle. And that isn't going to be about putting out a press release. That is about getting an authentic relationship going and achieving compromise.
Definitely, Bridget. I think that's a really good point. I think as our job as communicator, and I think Martin and Paddy mentioned it about this grey area that's in the middle, and it not necessarily is right and it's not necessarily that's wrong, but what we need to do is reflect what all the information we're getting, all of that comms, and kind of pull up the truest picture that we can, really, with all the information. And kind of thinking about that brings me really nicely onto my next question. You know, what are those tools that you use? I know that this month the CIPR have come up with a really good set of kind of different fact sheets that we can look at. The decision tree, I had a look at it earlier this month, and I think that it's a really good one, you know, to actually just think about things step by step. So just out to the panel, what other tools do you use to help you with your ethical dilemmas?
All of those. I'm going to sort of take the space on this straight away, because if you're a public sector communicator, use all of the CIPR tools, CIM, whatever guides we've got amongst our own learning resource. There's brilliant stuff out there. It's available at the click of a button by signing in through your membership. Some of it's open source content as well. But go to your own organisation too. So have you got a constitution? Incidentally, I didn't mention the CIPR's code of conduct. All of the ethics are just embedded in working to the code of conduct. Even if you find the tools overwhelming, go to the code of conduct and think about that in the context of the practice you're delivering day to day. But what's your organisational constitution? What's your values and behaviours? What's your disciplinary policy? All of those things that your organisation sign up to should be used in the context of those guides, principles, models. You know, I've mentioned it once already. The Nolan principles, they exist to help us achieve a certain set of standards in public life. So there's just tons of stuff out there to help navigate through what can be some tricky problems.
Thanks, Bridget. Martin?
I think, yeah, Bridget's right. She's called out the things that are available from CIPR, and I'll just mention one in the context of internal comms, which is the CIPR Inside Ethics Guide, which is specifically written for internal communicators. So it builds on the CIPR code of conduct, and it translates that into what it means for internal communicators. So there's that. But I think there are other sources. So if you care to delve into, I don't know, academia, I suppose, and look at some of the literature on ethics, there are some interesting constructs of ethics. So there's a consequentialist and the non-consequentialist models of ethics, and those might help you think about a situation that you're dealing with. So the consequentialist is, is that, you know, the consequences of something are more good than they are bad. So therefore, you know, that helps you to make the decision. Non-consequentialist is about motive. So what's the motive behind a decision or an action? So those are good things to kind of think about as well. But I think it's just worth calling out, you know, calling out the some of the guides that are being published over the next few weeks by CIPR. So there is one that's been published this week, which is about ethical decision making, and I'd certainly recommend having a look at that as well.
Yeah, definitely. Paddy?
I would, again, this is slightly from my own personal external comms experience, but I would always cross-check everything against how you know you are perceived, and be entirely objective about how you know you are perceived and what you have said before. And it's one of those situations where I think that's it. I hate bringing the gut test into a question which is primarily about systemic approaches, but don't ignore the gut test as well, because systemic approaches can help you get round the feeling in your gut, because you feel that, oh, I've done the process and it's all okay, whereas actually you have this lingering doubt in the back of your head that this isn't right. And I think that's important as well, is to always remember the instinctive side as well as the process driven side of comms.
Yeah. So when you get that, just picking up on that point, Paddy, when you get that feeling, that gut feeling, how do you get that to a resolution with that? Because, you know, on one side, I suppose that's it, but coming back to that whole being that conscious, on one side, you've done everything, you follow the decision tree, you've done all of that, you can tick all the boxes, but there is that kind of point where you're using all your experience and your knowledge, and you're like, this still doesn't fit. How do we like kind of get that balance when we're thinking about that?
This is tough. It really does depend on the specific situation, and it really does depend on the organization that you're working in and the task that you have. I can give examples of positions where I've worked it out. For instance, I've been fortunate enough to work in organizations that are open to discussion, and it turns out that I was missing some information, and the boss said to me, yeah, you'd be absolutely right if you didn't know about this, and you didn't know about it, so I'm not going to shout at you. You've done exactly the right thing to come to me, and here is the missing piece of ingredient. And that's fine. And I think it's one of those situations where I'm slightly hesitant about comms being the conscience of an organization, in spite of being in the fortunate position where traditionally I advise CEO and chairman. I think they are the conscience of the organization. I think the executive is the conscience of the organization, and we can influence that conscience. But at the same time, I think that's it. I think it is having an open culture within the organization where these things can be discussed to ensure that you come to the outcome which all parties are comfortable with, is probably the best way to answer the question.
Open that out to anybody else.
So I think I've got an example that encapsulates that. How do you know when, you know, if something's not right in your gut, what do you use to guide you? So I was in a situation as quite a young press officer once where the media had picked up on a murder at the police force that I was working for, where somebody had been shot in the street one evening. It was in an area that has, it was Moss Side. It's an area that traditionally got a lot of gangland crime. And the local media outlet turned around to me and said, unless you can tell me a good reason why I shouldn't think this is a gangland murder, I'm going to report it as a gangland murder. Now, policy was I had to get stuff signed off by senior officers, you know, very, very strict sign off in public sector organisations. But I worked in a really, really positive culture at Greater Manchester Police, where we've been told if there's a good reason for public good to break policy, then you should. Now, I had data on my side as well. So facts tell us if somebody thinks a victim of crime is wronging themselves, which I don't like that concept of, because I think life's all shades of greys, you get a very low uptake on your appeal. So couldn't get hold of an officer to sign off me releasing that information, although I could see it there on a log available to me. So I took the decision, logged it in our systems to say, I've made a decision to break policy myself, because if the media report this, it is going to mean that the appeal to catch the killers of this individual who's just a victim of a robbery gone wrong, that, you know, we are likely to see a lower uptake in the appeal. As a result of me releasing that information and that being reported accurately in the media, my communications work led directly to the arrest and conviction of the killer. So it was scary to do it, but, you know, morality guided me, because that victim deserved the integrity of the investigation around their death preserving, and actually, you know, results show it was the right thing to do.
That's a really good example there. And I suppose it's kind of comes to that thing around, you know, picking our battles sometimes when we know that we're in the right and we know that it's the right thing to do. Sometimes it's about just taking that autonomy to do that. I think there's a question there around, you know, when is the right time to just bow out and say, right, that's it, I can't really do this anymore. It's kind of not hitting my ethics. I've tried my best to get to the best situation. You know, what's that tipping point where, you know, you might just walk away from the situation? So, Paddy, I'll hand to you first.
Thanks. I've got to be quite delicate about this, but I resigned a position a long time ago on an ethical basis, in that the consultancy I was at was working for an organisation and that appeared to be entirely legitimate. And then after a number of months looking at it and speaking to my contacts, I realised that that wasn't the case. And there were some quite nefarious actors involved, which I believed represented a danger to national security. The challenge around this was that they were extremely high paying and extremely profitable for the organisation involved. I took my concerns to various different levels of seniority, including the guy with his name on the brand, and was effectively told, put up or shut up. And it was the realisation that this couldn't go on. But I have to be honest as well, and the push factor was when I spoke to both a journalist and a banker that I had to deal with on an everyday basis, and they knew most of the work that I was doing was entirely straight, but they were aware that we were working with this organization, and they said, look, I don't know if I can trust you, because you're working with this organization, you're working with these organizations in the same part of the world that I've mentioned. Are they all crooks? And that was the encapsulation of why ethics matter on a personal basis and an institutional basis. I still speak to those people because I made the choice that it was time to go. And that's where it gets to. You realize that on an ethical basis, it's personally unmanageable, but also there is a practical career management basis as well of, unless you're in the situation where, and I'm entirely straightforward about this, in some of the sectors that I've worked around, you can earn $1 million+ a year being a certain sort of comms person. Do that for a number of years, you can retire in your 40s and go off and found charities and do good work, or whatever it is you want to do. But that is a choice as well. That's an ethical choice that you've made that maybe you're comfortable with. I wasn't, and remain in that situation. So I think that's the point of, everyone has their point of, this is the person I want to be, this is the work I want to do, and eventually you might be in a situation where you have to take a risk to your livelihood to say, no, this isn't right, I'm walking away. But I have to be honest as well, the real push came where it became apparent it wasn't just a philosophical decision, it was a career management decision, that it was time to go. So that's that.
Oh, I did it. Sorry, I was on mute. Had to happen. So thanks for sharing that, Paddy. That was a really interesting, and I think it kind of comes back to that I find with comms is one of those things that, you know, we're not afforded the same luxury as lawyers, that they can do it and then they've got all the things they can, like, kind of say, well, you know, I'm acting within the letter of the law and everything like that. As comms professionals, a little bit of us and our integrity goes with us with each and every job. So that's a really interesting point. So Paddy, thank you for sharing that. Bridget, do you want to come in there as well?
Yeah, I think Paddy's touched on some of the big stuff where if you've been senior and been around for a number of years, you might well have been faced with one of those challenges, and you're probably quite lucky if you haven't, which is, you know, what do I want to be associated with in my career? You know, there's a nice link through of, you know, can I look in the mirror when I go home tonight if I carry on working on this contract? So, you know, I don't have to be quite as delicate because I've worked on a number of different roles and had a number of different consultancy contracts as well. And, you know, I've picked and choosed and I've walked away from things when I've thought, no, I've tried to change the people. And so now I need to change the people, if that makes sense. If I can't change the people here, I'm going to change the people that I work with. So I'm quite similar-minded to Paddy in that way. But I think there's more day-to-day stuff around picking battles around ethics matters as well. And in some of the prep we were doing for this session, I can think of real day-to-day routine examples where you're getting nagged for the comms tactic that you know isn't going to deliver. That's an ethical dilemma in itself. And actually, I think there's something about picking your battles around stuff like that, because if you're working with a senior leader who wants to, you know, done a lot of internal comms as well as external comms over my time. I've managed a lot of integrated functions. And a classic one is, oh, we want to do some town halls. Right, why do you want to speak to 500 staff, 3,000 staff, whatever it might be? And they don't quite know. And they're talking to people for the sake of talking to people. And I think that's a bit unethical. And you're dragging people away from their day to day when they could be delivering output for you, when you've not actually got anything that, you know, you want to create meaningful engagement out of. You just want to be seen, really. And, you know, don't get me wrong, I very much believe in visible leadership, but there's, you know, I'm almost talking through the dilemma in itself. So some of that stuff I've picked my battle around to actually help me win the war, because, you know, leaders nagging to do town halls and not having a right lot around their own strategy to be able to really motivate, engage and inspire a workforce, they're only going to sit in front of those people once and find themselves quite dumbstruck and in a clunky session, to know that the next time when they ask you to do that, they're going to want a longer internal comms strategy and to make sure that those set pieces are more structured and actually delivering better for them. So I do think there's something in our day-to-day practice as well around, you know, it is a little bit of an ethical battle, and you can pick them to win the war, which is, you know, if you argue all day, you're probably not going to have a job to be able to keep doing this stuff. So actually let the leader go out and realise that it's a bit of a dull thud doing that, and then the next time you can do it better.
Yeah. Martin,
that's a good point that Bridget kind of raises there about, we often think about ethical dilemmas in the context of this big stuff, the crisis and wrongdoing and all that sort of thing, but actually they happen in every you know, every working day basically. And, you know, people asking for things that aren't necessary is, you know, perhaps wasting people's time is perhaps one of those things. But I think there's you know, it's worth thinking about that in terms of what's the seriousness of the consequences of doing this thing or going along with something. And, you know, if it is going to teach a leader a lesson, then maybe that's a good outcome actually. You know, it's maybe not going to do, you know, massive damage in the organisation overall. So whereas, you know, another decision might be completely disastrous. You know, it might take an organisation down a route or towards a particular destination that is not beneficial for the employees or the organisation itself. So you know, what's the consequences of making the compromise?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Martin, because I was thinking about it from a more day-to-day ethical decision, and it is that we want to do something. And I think thinking about the diversity and inclusion space a lot recently, some of the campaigns that we're looking at for the year, and it's that transparency that's there. We want to do something big, we want to do this, we want to do that. That's brilliant. But what have we got underneath that? You know, looking at the users, really, you know, we're going to talk about women for International Women's Day, which is brilliant. What examples have we got? Because, you know, social media can be a fickle area. And if you put somebody up and they're saying, look, we're great at doing this, or we're great at doing that. All you need is somebody to come back with some really cold, hard facts that that's just not true. And I suppose with that as well, it comes into the lines to take, which are always my favourite. When you write some really stinky lines to take, and then you hand them to the senior team, and they're like, "Oh, I don't think anyone's going to ask that, do you?" But it's a case of they might do,
Maybe.
and if they do, what are our answers? And it's kind of like, isn't that your job to commsify it or something like that? And that, you know, is a massive, you know, moral, ethical decision for us as communicators.
I think Rebecca, there's another good point actually before we move on from that, which goes back to being a member of a professional body. If you're a member of a professional body like CIPR, you are bound by the code of conduct. Now, sometimes that's an interesting standing point to actually have that conversation with somebody who's asking you to do something that feels a little bit odd or a bit dodgy. You know, my professional code of conduct, you know, prevents me from doing that. Lawyers have the same thing, you know, financial people have the same thing. You know, why shouldn't we use our codes of conduct and hold those up as our professional standard and say, actually, I'm not allowed to do that. Now, it might lose you your job. You know, you never know. But actually, you know, sometimes, you know, waving those things in people's faces can be quite helpful in terms of just opening up a conversation about, well, is there a better way to do this?
That is a really good point, Martin, and something that I must say I've never thought about using, although I look at the code and, you know, as part of my CPD, I'm very kind of really invested in ensuring that, you know, I follow the right ethical standpoints, and, you know, I really do take that very seriously. But I think that I never use that part, whereas like other people do have that luxury of being able to do that. Sorry, that was the door just going. Just thinking about the next question, kind of mirror to that one really. So, you know, we've got our code of conduct, which is obviously set in stone, and then we've got our own personal ethical codes. You know, is there a time that anyone in the panel could think of that they've had to break that ethical code for the greater good?
Yeah, so I've got a really solid example around this that was painful at the time, and I don't think lightly of it, but I know in hindsight still that I did the right thing in the moment, and even now, nearly 10 years on, it was the right thing to do. So I happened to be duty media officer at the scene of an incident where a firefighter sadly died, and we knew that he wasn't going to survive the injuries that he'd suffered in the fire. It all unfolded in front of us. Fortunately, I'd managed to get the cordon extended, which shows the sort of interaction between, you know, comms can influence the operations to actually protect certain audiences and stuff, because, you know, dignity around that man's death was really vital. He was taken away in an ambulance, so you know, it was pretty clear. We hadn't had official word back from the hospital yet, but there had been media at the scene all day, although albeit they hadn't, you know, seen what had occurred. And a photographer asked me outright, because I think they'd sort of picked up on the mood and the sudden change and the fact that there'd been some ambulance activity, and they said, "Oh, as one of your crew died," and I just instantly thought, hang on, this could end up, you know, one of the biggest regional dailies of daily newspapers in the country who've got national reach. This could end up on their Twitter feed before that man's family's actually heard. So I outright said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. Now, there is something on my side when you think about proper process as well, because no one at the scene could confirm death. You know, we're not doctors. It's in the gift of a medically trained individual or some proper official to certify that death, albeit we knew what had happened and we saw the extent of those injuries. But that really wasn't in my decision making, I must admit, in hindsight. What was in my decision making at the moment was that man's family deserved to feel to be informed properly, and they don't deserve to have seen it first, albeit that they don't know it's their relative. They shouldn't read it on a website. They shouldn't see it on a Twitter feed. So I was maintaining the priority audience. And actually, I did have that in my head at the moment because I'd been trained. And I think this relates to the importance of training and knowing who your priority audiences are in any crisis as well. Because if you work for a public sector organisation where you are at risk of one of your employees dying, your order of priorities: family first, crew second, wider organisation third, public fourth after that. And it's a really good guide to go by. So I've no regrets about that, but I've never ever told an untruth to a member of the media otherwise.
Yeah, that's a really good example, Bridget. Has anybody else got an example similar to that to build on?
Or I hate to say it, exactly the same. Not I've worked in extractives for 20 years. Fortunately, both energy and mining are much safer than they used to be, and the companies that I work for have always had health and safety at their heart, but things go wrong, accidents happen. And I was asked by quite a high profile journalist when there'd been an incident on a rig in the North Sea, had anyone died? I was very aware that someone had, but it hadn't been announced because they couldn't get hold of the man's family. And so I lied, because he was the sort of person that wouldn't take a hedge, if you see what I mean. It had to be binary, and it was the right thing to do. And he agreed with me when I saw him 6 months later that I'd done morally the right thing, and and it was all okay. But at the same time, you have hammered into you as a young PR, never lie to a journalist. But this is sort of the point about what we're talking about, is that there are greater levels of practice than don't lie to a journalist. You have to understand why we're there in the first place. And so, sorry, Bridget, it's exactly the same as yours, but it is that understanding of where we fit, both in our organisation and society.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Paddy. It's kind of, I think we've touched on this a lot, that grey area, and us as comms professionals really sometimes work in that area, and it's important that we kind of hold ourselves up to a higher level of, you know, morals sometimes, because yes, sometimes the facts are there, and in a process driven world it's the right thing to do, but then, you know, coming back to that publics piece, we have to see it from all angles and think about how it would look for the organisation that we're working on. So one of the the last question here is, you know, thinking about topical ethical challenges, which we've, you know, talked on a lot today. You know, in 2022, what should we look out for? You know, what do you think those big ethical dilemmas are going to be? And, you know, what tips would you give to other comms professionals on this call to help them manage and navigate them for them and their organisation?
I'll go first if it's okay. I think again, in the context of organisational communication, hybrid working is a biggie. So we're still in this transitional period as we come out of the pandemic, and all organisations are trying to find the right balance in terms of bringing people back into workplaces if they've been working remotely, for example. There are some questions there around how do you make sure that communications are democratic in an organisation where you've got people who are working in all sorts of different places. So in other words, you know, how do you make sure that some people are not disadvantaged about understanding things that are happening in the organisation? Because sometimes, you know, people working remotely can make them more difficult to reach. So I think from a sort of a channel communication strategy is, you know, how do we continue to make sure that there's fairness and equity in communicating with, particularly with employees, for example, across organisations in a very different kind of working situation that we're going into.
That's a really good point. Bridget, Paddy, have you got anything to add to that?
I think Martin stole my thunder a little bit there, but I'll build on it, and it's a bit of a different twist on it. So I was taking part in some research with Susan Kinnear, a university lecturer and PR practitioner down in Cardiff, and talking about my experiences of being a public relations leader in an organisation as we went into the pandemic. The previous role that I was in before was at Bradford Council, and I think we struggled with inclusivity. We sort of, I think people went to some of their safe space. So I was working in the nuclear sector at that point, and I found that actually where I'd been quite an active member of the board or certainly an advisory member, I wasn't a full voting member, but I certainly found that the core men from the sort of proper disciplines and not the sort of advisory disciplines or ones that they struggle to see as a strategic management function, we were excluded from that a little bit. And it was interesting reflecting on it as part of a research project, because I think it's something that will continue, and it absolutely relates to some of the themes Martin was discussing, which is democracy and continuing with hybrid working, because I think the pandemic put us back a little bit in some of the work that we've done to be more inclusive in terms of the range of functions that we use, the kind of people who might be from non-traditional white male backgrounds, certainly in some of the organisations that I was working in at that point in time. And I think we went back a few stages. So I think, how do we rebalance that and actually improve on it to continue with hybrid working?
Yeah, I think hybrid working is a really big one for us. Paddy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, being aware of knowing disinformation. I picked up on something today. There is an organisation that's very well funded and is very high volume around energy at the moment, that knows nothing about energy and is entirely political, and it's saying stuff that might be useful to people like me tactically, but actually if you step back and look at what they're doing strategically, it's really not cool. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of, is bad faith actors and disinformation for their own strategic gains and false friends. And I'm sure this has been going on as long as there's been communication, but I think with the constant extrapolation of new channels and new content, it's something we all need to be aware of at all levels, whether you are manning Twitter on a weekend and you see something and you press forward, or whether you are advising whoever. You need to be aware that what looks like a tactical opportunity, look behind it to understand the strategic challenge.
It's a really good point, Paddy. And I always think that before, I think at the starting of social media, it was very easy to see the fakes. It was really easy to identify them. But I think now we're in the era of deep fakes. We're in the era of kind of people pulling up channels. And it's not so simple as we may see it and go, like, that's obviously not a true one. But some of our employees may, and start using that channel before we can even get to it. So I know if you are public sector, the gov.uk, GCS have a really good fact sheet called Resist. It's a really good tool to use in order to like combat and look at misinformation and disinformation. So that's a really good tool if you're lucky enough to be able to get that. I wanted to see if we had any questions. Do we have
we've had some good questions from everyone. So I'm going to go to Carl's first, as he'd said it so recently and had some good responses. So Carl says, where does no comment or off the record fit in an ethical context?
Oh, they're my favourite. I was always told not to never say no comment, and luckily in my career I've never, apart from obviously if it's if it's something to do with shares and stocks, you can actually say that, but apart from that, there's always a way of talking around it or to give some solid points. It may not say exactly what it is, but I think that no comment just opens up a kind of worms that I just don't think is appropriate to it's not an appropriate place to be as a comms person. I don't know if anybody on the panel would agree or disagree with that. I'll leave it.
I think there's a principle there about not being deliberately misleading, isn't it? I think that's the principle that kind of fits underneath the no comment sort of get out clause when you're asked difficult questions.
I think no comment as a phrase itself is quite aggressive, but actually, is it appropriate not to provide a response on something? A lot of the time, yeah, because particularly in public sector organisations, when you're working on the external comms side of it as well, if something's happening and the agency responsible won't respond, they'll go to the next agency that they can get hold of. So actually, it's not appropriate for us to comment because you know, we're the police and the hospital are dealing with it, or you know, we're the police and the fire service are dealing with it. You know, there is, but it's about how you go around. You wouldn't want to end up on camera saying no comment. You know, there's a way around that. So there's something about that. I noticed the other bit was about off the record in Carl's question as well, and I do think nothing's ever really off the record. I've always taught that in media training, but I think it goes back to really authentic relationships. You should be able to have a mature conversation to give people context to help them, to help different publics relate, because a lot of the time, if you're not proactively investing in your relationships, and the media particularly are finding out things called, or your staff even, are finding out things called from a report or an announcement without doing some kind of build up with the direct relationship, then that's when you're going to get that polarization, which I think is a particular problem in 2022, where that's that person's view, that's that person's view, and they're miles apart. And actually, as public relations professionals, we want to find the sweet spot is where's the overlap to deliver an outcome for an organisation where the two realities overlap.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I do like that kind of that overlay, and I think to your point as well about off the record, giving that context. I can remember like kind of in my day having heated conversations with journalists at a point, and then just saying, you know, let's just take a break. Can we just have a bit of an informal chat so that you can see it from my point of view, and then carrying on. But that is a lot to do with relationship building, and there were certain journalists that I could do that with, and certain journalists which I just didn't have that relationship, so couldn't do that with. So it was very much email, here are the bullet points, and you know, just not really getting anywhere sometimes. Hope that helps to answer the question.
That was great, everyone. We've had another question from James quite early on in the session, who says, we've touched on the importance of objectivity when evaluating the ethics of your work. How do you ensure objectivity with your own work that you are naturally so invested in? And he's looking for some practical tips and tricks to zoom out and depersonalize your work.
I'd say first thing to do is talk to a fellow comms person about it. Sometimes you cannot see the wood for the trees, and I think in my line of work, a lot of the work that I do is really complex, and it's just full of so much complexity. Sometimes I just get so into it that I think I'm doing the right thing, but then actually getting somebody, and they don't necessarily have to be from the same area. They can just look at it and go, well, that doesn't make sense because of this, this, and this. Just like a different perspective, it just really helps. So just have those key people that you can go to. And I'm always an advocate of sometimes just taking a break from it, walking away, having a cup of coffee, doing something else, just to give yourself a bit of a break from it as well. So Paddy, you're nodding away, so I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I'm really lucky. She's left the profession now, but I'm married to someone that did government affairs for 12 years. So I can ask Kirsty. She's also far more ethical. The best example I can give is she is now a trainee SEN teacher. So Kirsty cares about giving stuff back to society. Kirsty cares about engaging with society on a very moral basis, whereas I advise sovereign states and energy companies. And so I get brutal feedback from my wife, which is useful and vital. And if you're not fortunate enough to have married Kirsty, find yourself a mentor, I think, as well. I've really benefited from finding, perhaps not maybe as formal as mentorship, but sort of professional friends that I trust, that I respect, who can give me a different perspective on things and aren't going to go and blabbing to everyone about what I'm asking. So I think that's it as well. Find yourself professional, respectful relationships where you can bounce ideas off in a safe space.
Yeah, and I suppose it comes back to this community of CIPR, and I think that, you know, when I think about the amount of comms colleagues, and, you know, I'd count amongst some of my really good friends that are brilliant comms professionals, and people that I can go to get that different perspective, and vice versa. Has anybody else got some tips?
Yeah, I think I build on the points of having a good network of trusted confidence, but I'd say this is for the manager. Sorry, there's a cat and dog fight there. Network of trusted confidence, but this is also very clear for those of us who are managers, the case for diverse teams, because this is about the different views of people bringing judgment, knowing the professional basis on which we practice. So it's the case for diversity. The other thing to remember as well, it's a really, really simple one. In one of my internal comms roles, I reported into a director of people and leadership, and she was brilliant at doing tough conversations and doing the disciplinary stuff and things like that. And one of the reasons was she was very, very good at compartmentalizing as a leader, friendships she had with people in the organisation and the work. So she'd come from quite a regulated sector where health and safety was really, really vital. And she was like, look, this is the work. It's not your own house, was her common phrase. And we need to remember that as well. This is not our own house. These are not our own houses. We might be really, really passionate about the work that we do. I certainly am about what public services deliver for our communities, but this is a job of work. It's not our own house. And we need to maintain that this is a job of work to do. And we need to make sure that we are, you know, if it's a disciplinary we're executing as a leader, or, you know, it's a debrief, we do it with professionalism in mind, and not the fact that we don't want to hurt someone's feelings.
I think there's a thing about you know, being skilled in reflective practice, and that's something that gets taught certainly on some of the CIPR PR qualification courses, is how to be a reflective practitioner. And there are several models of that you can use that actually help you get around your biases, because that's what we're talking about, really. We're talking about our own inherent biases. And again, you know, just to shout out some of the playbooks that are being published at the moment by CIPR. Heather Yaxley's written quite a lot of that. She's an academic, and Heather is very big on reflective practice, and there are some really good models in there and techniques that you can use. So have a look at reflective practice if you don't know what it is and want to learn how to do it.
Thank you, Martin. Have we got any other questions, Rebecca?
Yeah, we have a few more. So I think this one from Sarah is really interesting. So she says, away from my day job, I run a foodie blog and Instagram account. I find it no end of frustrating that PR practitioners will continue to work with influencers who repeatedly fail to properly declare their ads. Surely as PR professionals, we have some responsibility there. So I suppose it's not really a question, but more a discussion point about, as kind of types of media change, how do we make sure that we carry through our ethics into everyone that we work with?
Yeah, so with that one, I think that when you're, as a PR person, if you're working with somebody, that you put that information on there, as in, you know, what it is that you need to do, because I suppose in two ways. Sometimes influencers may not know what it is. Yep, I've always said that, you know, the ASA and CMA have made it very clear. Maybe direct them to those places, because, you know, if you're going to work with a client, you need to make sure that they're upholding the right ethical standards, because that will then reflect on your brand, because, you know, you'll then be associated with that. But also, if you've got a foodie blog, please put the comment in there. I always like looking at some foodie blogs, so put it in there. I'll hand over to Bridget.
Sorry, my mind's been on the standoff that's escalating behind me.
Oh gosh, should we move on?
I think it's resolved.
Martin, any kind of tips on how to help influencers to actually state ads and things like that?
I think actually I'm gonna hold up the code of conduct, and I'm going to say that is actually beyond my experience and my skill set. So important to say, sometimes that's, an expert in those sort of things. So I wouldn't be able to comment credibly on that question.
Paddy, anything from you?
No, I'm with Martin, other than this feels very like the situation I saw this morning where I called out a political think tank for having a view on which they're not educated, and recognizing this is an ongoing issue and being prepared to be public about calling out what feels like poor communications practice by communications professionals is something that we should do, sometimes more discreetly than others, because you don't know who's behind the screen. But at the same time, I think it's the sort of thing we all need to be aware of, and as a community of practice, work together on.
Yeah.
I think we need to not be afraid to get stuck in on this stuff to build on some of these points, which is, it's not an old area by any means where any of us are vastly experienced. But if we see things that don't look, if it looks bad and it smells bad, it probably is bad. Go back to that gut feeling stuff. So report it via the channels that exist. And I think there's a more strategic piece for us to work with other organisations to skill up, school up, and work with business leaders to know actually what are the pros and cons of working with some of these new channels. I don't think we should shy away from using new channels, because we should go where the audiences are, but we need to, we can't tackle it alone as a membership body of CIPR professionals or CIM professionals or whatever it might be. We need business to understand that if they're going to work with these influencers, there's a lot of bear traps to consider.
Yeah, definitely. But I think there's that piece of making sure that we're doing the right thing. So as PR professionals, you can direct your influencers to the right things, whether they take that up or not. In the first kind of tranche through is important. And if they don't, you can then just remind them again, because it's your brand reputation on the line as well as your own reputation. And I think that's something that we all could be, reflective of. I'm just conscious of the time. We've just got 3 minutes left. Rebecca, is there another question we could quickly get in, or?
I think Sarah was going to pop on and say a few words.
Yeah, brilliant.
Hello. Thank you so much, everyone. That was a really interesting panel. It's a lot of kind of really insightful points were made, and excellent case studies and references. So thank you everybody who joined us for this session. I hope it's been of some value. I know there was a couple of questions that we didn't quite get to. So we might try and see if we can answer those another way, or I'll speak to the panelists afterwards and maybe see if we can get those answered for you, because there's a couple of really good ones there. I know a couple of people have to jump off already, but huge thank you to our panelists, Bridget, Martin, Paddy and Rebecca. Thank you so much for giving your time this afternoon. It was a really great session, and we shall let you all go. The recording will be up. We're not sure when. We're going to send it across to Central, and then it'll going to be put on the CPD database. So bear with us for a few days whilst we get that up, but it should be there if you need to refer back to it, or if you weren't able to join us live today, you will be watching this on record. All right, thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.